Joining us today, Scott Lukas, Professor of American Studies at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lukas.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back here. It's one of my favorite times of the week.
Thank you. The US has imposed sanctions against Russia's two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, in effort to bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table. Also, President Trump has cancelled his summit with Vladimir Putin in Budapest. Has Vladimir Putin finally overplayed his hand during his recent phone call with Trump?
Well, I think it is one of the most important days in these 45 months that Ukraine has resisted the full-scale invasion. I think it is because Vladimir Putin has overplayed his hand, but he always overplays his hand. So the question is, why is this time different as we talk about the Trump administration sanctioning the two largest Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil? It's because it's only part of the connection of events today. So the Americans have announced these sanctions. And remember, this is only weeks after Donald Trump had stepped away from those sanctions because he was going to meet Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Now you have the US sanctions on the same day that the European Union announces its 19th package of sanctions. Now, those sanctions from Europe include a commitment to end the imports of Russian liquefied natural gas by January 1st, 2027. That was something that the Trump administration was calling for. They were saying, look, if you want us to put sanctions on Russia, you have to cut off these energy supplies. Europe has done that. They have put more sanctions on the tankers who are the shadow fleet that try to circumvent the oil restrictions. They have put further sanctions on Russian financial institutions. But we can go farther. We can talk about the fact that the European Union is now considering support that is needed for Ukraine to maintain itself, for its public services, for its government, for its finances, as it withstands the invasion, of 140 billion euros. That loan will be drawn from Russia's frozen assets in Europe. And then, combining all of that, we now have confirmation from American officials this week that although Donald Trump, in that meeting with Vladimir Zelensky last Friday, stepped away from providing the Tomahawk cruise missiles, that Trump officials have granted permission for Ukraine to use British and French missiles on strikes inside Russia. And indeed, we know that some of those British Storm Shadow missiles were used in Western Russia earlier this week in a strike on a major chemical factory. So bring all of that together. And the result of Vladimir Putin, less than a week after he used a phone call to manipulate Donald Trump, less than a week later, because he would not compromise on his demands for more Ukrainian territory, especially the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, less than a week after he made that phone call, because he would not stop attacking civilian areas as well as energy infrastructure, including a significant attack only 36 hours ago. Because he will not do that, he faces increasing pressure, not just from Europe, but yes, from the Trump administration. Even though Donald Trump is still unpredictable, still chaotic, what has happened is that Ukraine and Europe are working with Trump administration officials who are the adults in the room to try to contain, to try to restrict what the Kremlin can do.
You just mentioned this huge attack on Russia's regions with British-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles. It was a large, full-scale combined arms attack with Ukrainian drones fired at Russia, long-range drones, short-range drones, Ukrainian-made missiles, and also British-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles. President Trump says that he has nothing to do with that. However, as you mentioned, Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. has allowed the strike to be conducted by Ukraine. However, from your perspective, what did really happen in the White House between President Trump and President Zelensky?
Well, I've got a specific story for you on why I know that those Storm Shadow missiles were used with U.S. permission. And I'll tell you that in just a minute. But in the meantime, that meeting last Friday, which was so, I think, disappointing to people who support Ukraine, because we were thinking, okay, Donald Trump, as I've said before, he spins like a weather vane, but we thought he was spinning in the right direction, and he would support the Tomahawk missiles. He was told on Thursday by Vladimir Putin, if you provide those Tomahawks to Ukraine, it will hurt the relationship between the U.S. and Russia, and it will hurt our long-term dealings. And those include, of course, economic dealings. And Trump is always the businessman, always wanting to think that he can make a profit. And Putin's saying, you can't do that if you give the Tomahawks. But equally bad was that Donald Trump had brought in Steve Witkoff into the room. Now, Steve Witkoff is the supposed envoy to Russia, who's the real estate developer. And he's the one who repeatedly gives the Kremlin's lines. He has met several times with Vladimir Putin, including one time when there were no other Americans in the room, and Witkoff's interpreter was a Russian intelligence officer. So Witkoff, whether he's naive, whether he's quite happy to work with the Russians, he told Zelensky, why don't you give up all of the Donetsk region? Give up that 25% you hold, because the people there, many of them are Russian speakers. As if simply because people speak Russia in Ukraine, Ukraine should be handed over to Moscow. Simply because people in America speak English, I guess by that logic, they should be handed back to England. So when Witkoff says this to Zelensky, and we think maybe Trump is supporting Putin in terms of taking more territory, you wonder, has the Kremlin succeeded again? By the end of the meeting, however, something important happened, and that is that Trump, whether because other American officials pulled him back or because Zelensky persuaded him and pulled him back, Trump is not demanding that Ukraine give up more territory, not giving up all of Donetsk. And instead, he says, we want to have negotiations on the basis of the current front lines, almost freezing them in place. And of course, that is what the Kremlin rejected. By the time we get to Tuesday of this week, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, is not only saying that Russia has to be given more territory, that its special military operation continues, but he is saying, there are no security guarantees for Ukraine, and he is saying, even in fact, the Zelensky government has to be removed because it is a supposed Nazi government. So clearly the Kremlin has rejected even after Trump had helped them out on Friday, they're rejecting his basic condition, freeze the front lines. Okay, what does that mean for the British Storm Shadow missiles? It so happened that earlier this week, I was at a two-day gathering in London, which included military officials. And those military officials who know what is going on, they said, yes, the Storm Shadows are being used. In fact, the Storm Shadows may have been used before this week, but we know for sure they were used this week because this was publicly revealed. They said, yes, the Storm Shadows are being used. And the Storm Shadows can only be used, and these military officials know that, if the Americans have given permission. We know that the Biden administration refused to give that permission all the way up until the time it left office. So think of what a significant shift this is, that the administration led by Donald Trump, who is so unreliable at times, who has been so supportive of Vladimir Putin, it's the administration that lifts the restriction on using the British Storm Shadows and the French Scout missiles and the Tomahawks as Volodymyr Zelensky said last week, are still on the table. That meeting did not go well. It was a horrible meeting. But even at the end of the meeting, the tomahawks had not been ruled out completely because there are other administration officials in Washington who do want those tomahawks to be delivered. Now, here's what I said would tell you about why Trump said, oh, these aren't our missiles. These aren't the British Storm Shadow missiles. Well, indeed, they're not American missiles. They are British missiles. And equally important, the decision to allow Ukraine to use those missiles was taken away from the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth. He is not the one who made that decision because we know he is not exactly qualified. The decision to allow the British to use the Storm Shadow missiles was made by the top American commander at NATO, the supreme allied commander in Europe. He is the one who made the decision. So it's those officials that do not get the headlines, the military officials and the diplomatic officials, that are the ones that are advancing the American support for Ukraine. It's gradual, but it is advancing.
President Zelensky said that as soon as long-range missiles like Tomahawks were off of the table, Russia lost interest in diplomacy. Did Putin influence Trump's decision not to provide Ukraine with Tomahawks?
Yes, he did. And then he slapped him in the face because Trump's thinking, okay, what do I get for this? I told Zelensky, don't use the Tomahawks. And what do I get? Do I get the negotiations on the basis of the front lines? Do I get that summit with Vladimir Putin where he says, I'm going to freeze the front lines and I'm going to engage in talks, either direct or indirect, with Ukraine to cease fire? And Putin did. He slapped him in the face. And it goes back to Daniel's question at the start. Did he overplay his hand? And he has done this ever since Trump took office. Back in February, just to emphasize, the Kremlin had Ukraine and Europe off to the side. They had direct talks with the Americans. They had the American Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, talking about the priority on a long-term economic relationship. So would Russia step back on its attacks to give some space where they got that relationship, they got the lifting of U.S. sanctions, and they held onto the territory they occupy in Ukraine, not just Crimea, but parts of the east and the south? No, they did not step back. They kept attacking on the ground and from the air. In July, when there had been major talks that had taken place between Trump and Putin about the possibility, again, of getting a negotiated end, which would give the Kremlin much of what it wants, on July the 3rd. On July the 4th, Russia launched one of its largest missile and drone strikes across Ukraine, killing a number of civilians, leading Trump's wife, Melania, to tell him they've hit a nursing home. So once again, Trump was angry and said, I'm going to have to put sanctions on you. In mid-August, when Putin finally got the summit with Trump in Alaska, the red carpet treatment, he pushes back the idea of the sanctions. What does he do at that summit in Alaska? Does he back away from his demands? No, he says to Trump, we need to have all of the Donetsk region, and then gives him a long history lesson on why Ukraine is part of Russia. At every step of this year, the Kremlin has been in a position where it could use its manipulation of Trump to get, if not recognition, confirmation that it holds those areas of Ukraine that it currently occupies, and it could get a lifting of the sanctions. And on every occasion, Putin has insisted that he has to have more. And that, I think, has been his major mistake, as long as underestimating the ability of Ukraine to keep resisting those attacks on the ground and on the air.
We know that Donald Trump came up with the idea of the ceasefire on the current front lines. And we also know that Russia denied this idea. I would like to hear your opinion from your perspective. What this ceasefire on the current front lines would mean for Ukraine? And do you think that White House sees that Russia doesn't want peace and denying all possible ideas of a ceasefire?
I mean, even before Donald Trump took office, and I know that some of your great viewers don't like to hear this, and I know why they don't like to hear this, but even before the Biden administration left, the Zelensky government and the Ukrainian military were moving to the idea of a ceasefire in which Russia would continue to occupy parts of Ukraine. They would continue to occupy Crimea, as they've done since 2014, and they would hold, almost all of Luhansk, parts of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. They don't want that. They want Ukraine not only to be sovereign, but to have all of the territory back. But that's sort of the military reality. So they were happy, not happy. They would accept going into talks on that basis. Now, at the same time, let's be clear, there would be no legal recognition of Russia's occupation as annexation. Crimea would not be recognized as Russia, the fact that it was seized 11 years ago. The other areas of Ukraine that Russia occupies would not be recognized as annexed, despite the fact that Vladimir Putin declared the annexation of those 4 regions, all of those regions, in September 2022. But on that basis, that you accept the occupation in fact, if not legally, yes, Ukraine has been in a position to talk, and that's been reinforced by its European partners for months. That's what the Kremlin has rejected. And I think with Donald Trump, on some days, yes, he gets it, he understands, because he keeps seeing the Russian attacks and he keeps getting slapped on the face. And then Vladimir Putin calls him, and Trump thinks, oh, Vladimir's back, and he can be my friend, and maybe we can get a deal. And that lasts about 24 hours, and that is what we've seen over the years. And I've said this for months, and again, to your great viewers out there, it's not just Donald Trump who matters here. What matters is what the other Trump administration officials think. And I think, with the exception of people like Steve Witkoff, who's extremely naive, as well as being very easily manipulated by the Russians, with the exception of Steve Witkoff and a couple of other people, the Trump administration officials know that. They know the Russians aren't going to stop. And the question here is, will they or will they not support Ukraine in stopping the Russians? And that's where the division is in the administration. How much support do you give them? And I think what I'm trying to get across to you here is that gradually, those officials who want more support for Ukraine are advancing just a bit further, and not just on the military front. So let me give you another piece of the story. We began this conversation by talking about the American sanctions on Russian oil companies, which are in conjunction with the European package of sanctions, the latest package of sanctions on Russian oil, on Russian gas, and on financial interest. Those sanctions would have been coordinated well before Donald Trump met Vladimir Zelensky last Friday. Indeed, and I'm sure your viewers know this, there were other Ukrainians in Washington before Zelensky got there for high-level talks. One of those Ukrainians was the prime minister. The prime minister met the U.S. Treasury Secretary about a week and a half ago, and they would have discussed the sanctions. And other Americans would have discussed the sanctions with other Ukrainian officials and with European officials. All it took was one more slap in the face by Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump for those officials, American, European, and Ukraine, to say, okay, now is the time to make the move, which now includes those American sanctions on Russian oil companies. Now, you might say, what does that matter? Because those Russian oil companies, I think they only have about $5 billion of assets in the United States. That's not the important part of the sanctions. Those American sanctions can include secondary sanctions on Russia's trading partners, anyone who trades with Rosneft, who trades with Lukoil. That includes Chinese companies, Indian companies, companies in the UAE. In other words, it includes Russia's largest customers for oil. And if those companies are threatened by secondary sanctions and stop purchasing Russian oil, this has an effect. And as I speak to you, there is a report coming out from senior Indian oil industry executives, that India is reducing its purchases of Russian oil, or some Indian refineries are reducing their purchases of Russian oil almost to zero. Now, given how significant India's purchases of Russian oils had been for Moscow, given how it was the second largest customer after China, if those reports prove to be true and India is sharply reducing the oil purchases, that shows you where this pressure that we're talking about today is going to have an effect on Vladimir Putin.
And I would like to ask you our final question. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin told Trump that this was not a full-scale war, but so-called special military operation. He told Trump that if he could order his army to completely destroy Ukraine, if he would like to do so. Was Vladimir Putin successful enough to finally completely persuade Trump and take him on his side, on the side of Russia's Federation?
It doesn't matter whether you call it a war. It doesn't matter whether you call it a special military operation. It doesn't matter if you call it a duck that walks on water. What you had were not just Russian attacks on the front line. You had Russian missiles and drones that were hitting Kyiv, that were hitting Kharkiv, that were hitting Chernihiv, that were hitting most areas of the country this week. And those Trump administration officials who do want support of Ukraine will have gone to Trump and they would have shown him pictures, or they would have given him brief summaries of what happened. And they would have said, this is what Putin is doing. He is still attacking. So, the reason why I'm a bit flippant is I've heard that term special military operation for 45 months. I didn't believe it on day one of the Russian attacks that tried to break Ukraine, including the attempt to take over Kyiv. I don't believe it 45 months later. And any person who is an adult and is able to think knows that it is a Russian invasion, a full-scale invasion. So yes, I think even Donald Trump on most days knows that Ukraine is under attack by the Russians. It's just on those days when trying to escape the pressure on him, the Kremlin gets to him and they try to justify those attacks. Those are the days we have to worry about. But I'm not sure how many more times the Russians can do this. They have given Trump the face-to-face meeting that he always wanted with Putin in Alaska. That did not work. They have given Trump another phone call with Putin last week. That has not worked. At least it doesn't appear to have worked. They were going to give Trump another summit in Hungary, but because they wouldn't stop attacking Ukraine, that summit is now off. So what can you do? What can you do, Mr. Putin, so that Donald Trump thinks that your special military operation is more important than his desire to get the Nobel Peace Prize? What can you do, sir? You're running out of time to answer that because you are not winning this special military operation, and you are the one who is going to face increased economic, political, and yes, indeed, military challenges in the days and weeks to come.
Thank you, Professor Lukas, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraina. Thank you both very much. Stay safe.